Good evening, folks. Tonight's talk is From Darwin to Dictatorship, A Tale of Three Countries. I gave this many years ago, but I think it's especially appropriate today in light of what's been going on. And I have an addendum to this talk that will go into details of what is happening today in light of this presentation. So therefore, I have a phenomenal amount of material, even by my standards. So you're going to be drinking from a fire hose. So we're going to contrast the history of what has happened in Germany and Russia and in the US as a result of Darwin's legacy. But first, I'd like to start with Colossians. See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which is a great definition of evolution, which depends on human tradition and the basic principles of this world rather than on Christ. So we have a lot of people who have been taken captive by this religion that we call evolution. So here's the outline. We lay the foundation in Germany and its consequences, then the revolution of foundation in Russia and its consequences, and the evolution of foundation in America with the consequences, and then the solution. So let's turn to Germany. Now this is the photo of the first edition in English, The Origin of Species, and here's the title page, and I blew it up, tried to make it easier to see. It's by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. So here you can see that it has racism built into its title even, and of course evolution was, the attempt was to make evolution more respectable with a pseudoscientific base from what Darwin did. Well, the following year, Haeckel read the book in its German translation, so nobody lost time working on getting it translated and published in Germany. And he became the high priest of evolution on the continent in Germany. Now, he did some actual science, some real science, identifying 150 new species of marine invertebrates. After getting his MD degree, he actually practiced medicine for about a year and a half, and then the book came out in German, gave up the practice of medicine, went back to university, got his PhD, studying marine invertebrates, and then was, upon completion of his degree, his PhD, was named a professor at the University of Jena, where he had done his graduate work. And he also was talented as a very fine artist as well. This is his artwork showing various marine invertebrates. There are tremendous volumes of his artwork, exquisite stuff. Well, he couldn't find actual evidence for evolution, so he imagined it and published it as if it were actual evidence, but rather this all came from his fertile imagination. So Protomyxia aurantica refers to first mucus golden. And so he published this in 1868. He also put together the sequence of diagrams, which has been in, practically every American biology, basic biology textbook in high school and collegiate level. And this shows the supposed progression in utero of the development of the human from fish through amphibian, on through reptile bird, and then finally mammalian, and then primate states. Well, again, this was totally his imagination, but the worst thing is he actually stole diagrams from other professors on campus, modified them to put this together. And so here you see in the top row his diagrams versus photos of the actual embryos of the other species that he used. Now, other professors at the time when he published this decried this and said this was not real science. And he was actually taken to court, the university court that is, and was convicted of fraud. But he weaseled out of it by saying that the crime was perpetrated by the draftsman. But he didn't bother to tell them that he was the draftsman. So there he is at that time. And these are his works, which were known to not be true, but he published them in this book called The History of Creation, first published in 1876 and republished very frequently all the way up to 1926. That's pretty impressive. That's 50 years. So that shows that, you know, people hunger for what they want to believe, even if it has a false foundation. And the same is true today. We'll be talking about that some more. Well, one of the things that he put forth was this phrase, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Ontogeny is the development of the individual in the womb, and recapitulates means retraces, and then phylogeny refers to the evolutionary development of the species through all the stages. So what he's saying is the evolution of the individual in utero retraces the path of the evolution of the species. It's a very catchy phrase, and I remember that being drummed into our heads when I was in high school biology as well. So part of this picture that he puts together is that the quote gill slits in the neck were when we were in a fish stage, and a yolk sac like when we were in either an amphibian or a bird stage, and a dash reptile stage, and then this tail left over from when we were going through the primate stage. So these supposed gill slits, yolk sac, and tail are all his imagination. They actually are very different and have real functions and different names. The proper name for the gill slits is pharyngeal pouches. Never functioned as gills, ever, had nothing to do with oxygenation whatsoever. However, these pharyngeal pouches, there's 5 of them, and they have very important roles in the development of structures in and around the pharynx, the throat. So gill slits didn't happen. The yolk sac never contained any yolk, ever, had nothing to do with that. And if you think that's true, then the yolk's on you, and that's a bad yolk. What it is it provides the first site of blood formation, red blood cell, white blood cell formation in the body, and also tissue from the yolk sac, its real name, umbilical vesicle, migrates into the abdomen to form the major blood vessels in the abdomen and organs of reproduction. So it has very real function. And then the quote tail never was a tail. This is just simply where the tissue of the spinal cord and supporting structures grow faster than other things, protrude out, but then the growth of the remainder of the body catches up and then surrounds that. So its proper name is the coccyx, which is the very inferior-most portion of the spine. So the collective term for organs that are left over from evolution because of the supposed different stages that they go through and then they're discarded when something better comes along is vestigial organs. They're vestiges, they're leftovers of the evolutionary process. Well, another one of these supposed leftovers is the appendix. However, it has an extremely rich blood supply because it's an active organ. So if this were some leftover, it had no function, it would no longer have a rich blood supply. And it's a very important part of the immune system. It's in the gut. So when an infection comes along in the gut, it is what stimulates antibodies to be formed to counter the infection, both in the gut itself, the IgA, immunoglobulin A type antibodies for within the gut, and also stimulates the formation of IgG and IgM antibodies in the circulatory system in case the infection escapes the gut and enters the bloodstream as well. Another very important function of the appendix is it acts as a reservoir for beneficial bacteria. So if there is a really severe case of diarrhea and the gut gets washed out, the beneficial bacteria are replenished from the appendix so that they can be reestablished in the intestine. So the appendix is anything but a leftover from evolution. Now, however, there is one possible vestigial organ, especially in the view of the female portion of the human race, and that would be the male brain. As you see here, there's various components here, ball sports, TV, computer programming, video games, love for beer, whiskey, inability to ask for directions, commitment, molecule, listening particle, resting lobe, interruption lobe, and the atom of personal hygiene. Imagine we know folks who are somewhat like this. So that is how we are seen, us guys are seen, some of us guys are seen by some of the ladies. Now here is the original, on the right, the original quote tree that Darwin wrote in a sketch in one of his notebooks of life emanating from that first living organism, which he had no clue how it came into being. And then this in the left is the development of that concept by Haeckel. And so at the bottom is Moneron, this first living cell that he imagined. And then as you get to the very top there, it says Menschen, which is the German word for man. And that was meant in that context to be Caucasian white people. So Moneron at the bottom, and then reptilian amphibians, this is in German, and then Menschen there at top, you know, springing out of the primates. Well, here's a quote of Haeckel's. Now, if instituting comparisons in both directions, we place the lowest and most ape-like men, the Austral Negroes, the Southern Negroes, Bushmen and Andamans. Now, Bushmen would be in the, like in the Kalahari Desert, and Andamans are islands on the east side of India in the Bay of Bengal. Dark-skinned folks. On the one hand, together with the most highly developed animals, for instance, with apes, dogs, and the elephants. So in plain English, he's saying that people who have a lot of pigment are right in that continuum, right next to animals. And so here is a way of picturing what he was saying in that quotation. And then on the other hand, with the most highly developed men, Aristotle, Newton, Spinoza, Kant, Lamarck, or Goethe. So he's saying the supposed really smart folks, the philosophers and scientists, you know, at the other end of the spectrum and far away from those who are less evolved. So that's his concept there from that quotation. We can then no longer consider the assertion that the mental life of the higher mammals has gradually developed up to that of man as in any way exaggerated. So he's saying that from animals, through these dark-skinned, less evolved people, we finally get to the smart white guys. Pretty racist. And yet today people worry about racism, yet they're the very same people who support evolution. There's a little bit of schizophrenia there. Well, he needed a missing link to have this evolution occur from the primates to man, and he had no evidence, so he imagined this so-called missing link. He didn't even have any fossil evidence for it. Even though he was a good artist, he commissioned Gabriel Max, an outstanding artist of his time, to come up with this ape-man family. And he named it Pithecanthropus alalis, which means ape man without speech. Because he imagined that it would take a long time for speech to develop, since we know that the apes don't have speech. Well, another one of his phrases coined is, politics is applied biology. And this one's really unfortunate because the consequences of this one resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of people when it was applied in society at the national and international level. Politics is applied biology. Well, his decades of teaching this stuff, of being the high priest of evolution in Germany and on the continent, led to the development of some of these societies that were very much building on his foundation. So in 1895, Alfred Ploetz first proposed this ideology of racial hygiene, in other words, cleaning the race. And then in 1905, he and Dr. Ernst Ruden founded the German Society for Racial Hygiene. So they're advocating eugenics, eugenics meaning true or good genes, so that the bad genes would be removed. Well, in those days, Germany did have a few colonies. It was very late in the race for obtaining colonies in the rest of the world, because Germany didn't unite as a modern nation state until 1870. And already many of the other territories had already been taken by the other countries in Europe. But so one of the ones that it did have is what is known today as Namibia. Then it was known as German Southwest Africa. And they had two sets of laws there. Oh yeah, I want to highlight two peoples here, the Herero and the Nama, as in Namibia. And this is how the folks with lots of pigment, in other words, the local folks, were treated when they dared to rebel against the business of two sets of laws, one set for blacks and one for whites. And obviously the set of laws for blacks were quite harsh. So when some of the blacks decided to rebel against these laws, they were either shot outright, thrown in chains, and or put into concentration camps. So there actually were German concentration camps in that first decade of the 20th century, even before World War I. Or the other thing that was done to them is they would be cast out into the desert, having to fend for themselves, hoping they could find water and or food. And so you can see here how emaciated these people were for lack of proper nutrition. Well, you know, some other nations complained about this to an international organization, and the German leadership simply replied, well, these folks were not really people, they were less evolved, and so they don't have the protection of international laws designed to protect human life. So that was the foundation laid in Germany, and then the consequences we are pretty well acquainted with. And here's a quote of Hitler, that Christianity is an organized lie that must be smashed. The state must remain the absolute master. So the Nazis understood, by the way, Nazi means National Socialist. National Socialist. And they understood that they needed to capture the minds of the youth, going back to that opening quotation and from scripture. And so they had the Hitler Youth. And so, of course, they had these posters showing how superior and glowing and great they were. And so there was a lot of indoctrination there. And Hitler definitely put politics is applied biology into action. Well, how did he get power? Well, he used tactics of fear to cow the population into submitting into his rule, hopefully getting security and peace by giving up their liberty. And we'll return to that. So early on in this business of applying this business of racial hygiene, eugenics, and that politics is applied biology, started out just a year after he obtained power by having surgical sterilization become mandatory for people with certain conditions. And it would be things such as alcoholism, having seizures, being blind or deaf, having physical deformities, these types of things. Then he added surgical abortions. Now the abortions were to be done on those who were not considered to be part of the master race, the Aryan race. And yet abortions were also denied to those who were considered part of the Aryan race. Then euthanasia started being put into place for people with those problems I mentioned earlier, and putting them to death. And it says here that the cost of keeping this person alive costs you 60,000 Reichmarks a year. And this is, insane. That's the message of the poster there. It's not logical, I should say, because he was crippled. So here in Hadamar was the first killing center. So you can see smoke arising from the smokestacks of the building where they were killed and then the bodies were burned. So this is what was going on to their own German citizens. Well, in the 40s, medical experimentation was undertaken, and they were doing all sorts of things. And I put that in quotation marks. Some of the really cruel things that were done was they would break the femur, the thigh bone, set it at 90 degrees so that it would mend in that angle. Or they would take people from concentration camps and put them in ice cold water to see how long it took them to die. And their justification was saying that, well, this was a study to see what would happen to our pilots shot down in the North Sea. They also put people in snow, and then they would put one male together with either one or two females to see which was the most efficient way to heat them up. All sorts of stuff. There's other things that I'm not even mentioning that are even more grotesque. One of the other things they did was these high altitude pressure chambers to see how high people could, at what height they could no longer breathe. In other words, how high could their pilots fly without having problems? And then seeing what would happen if they only had salt water to drink if they're dunked in the ocean. And then they used poison on bullets to see if that would make the shooting more efficient, as in what to do with the opposing armies. And then mass surgical sterilization techniques, because Hitler's ultimate goal was to use the Slavic peoples for slave labor, work them to death, not allow them to reproduce, and then fill Eastern Europe with the master race. That was his long-term goal. Well, who participated in these, quote, experiments? German physicians. And was there an outcry? And the answer is no, because if you spoke out, you would be imprisoned or killed. So fear was a major tactic. And then some people didn't speak out just because they believed in this evolutionary stuff. Well, now we get to outright genocide, deciding to have the final solution to the Jewish question. So these crematoria, the prisoners were herded in, told they were going to be taking a shower, and out of the nozzles, instead of water for shower, it was poison gas to kill them. And then they were shoveled into these crematoria. This is President Eisenhower, at the time the general, in charge of the European theater for all of the Allies. And the things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things, if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations to propaganda. You can see Eisenhower was very prescient, because what have we had for several decades now? Certain Muslim countries denying that this ever happened. It's amazing. He was right on. Well, on my visit to Lithuania, I was taken to this area. These were fortifications that had been, when I say visit, I mean mission trip, fortifications that had been built when Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia were part of the Russian Empire prior to World War I. And so these were originally fortifications built by the Imperial Russian Army. So the Germans, when they occupied this territory, used them to house the prisoners, those who they were rounding up to keep them there until they could dispose of them. And then here is where you see the area built up to the left of the wall. That's where there's a mass grave of thousands and thousands of people's remains. And then they have in Lithuanian and in English and Russian this saying about how this should never ever happen again. Which is ironic, because the Soviets were doing some of the same stuff in the Gulag archipelago to their political prisoners. Well, here you see this iconic type drawing here, this, change in posture and physiognomy to become more human-like and then finally human. This is in every textbook you could imagine. So the teachings of Haeckel weren't confined to Germany and Darwin. They were spread throughout Europe as well as the Americas. So let's see what happened in Russia. Here's a quotation. Darwin put an end to the belief that the animal and vegetable species bear no relation to one another except by chance, and that they were created by God. In other words, no more creation by God. Anybody want to take a stab as who said this?
Looks like Marx.
Well, yeah, it says Marx, but that's part of the title. The actual person who said it was Stalin and Lenin. And Stalin had actually gone to a seminary when he was young. So Lenin and Stalin totally adopted the evolutionary scenario because it fit in with communism perfectly. No God. This was a statue given to Lenin by the American oil magnate Armand Hammer, who actually did a lot to help the Soviets survive the challenges to them with the disruption of their economy after the Civil War. He made some very favorable trade deals with him that made him a lot of money and gave them an economic basis for the revolution to survive. And one of the things that Hammer did was he gave Lenin this sculpture of the monkey looking at a human skull. With if you can read it, sitting on a book that says Darwin.
Yeah.
And here is the quote of Stalin. You know they are fooling us. There is no God. I will lend you a book to read. It will show you that the world and all living things are quite different from what you imagine, and all this talk about God is sheer nonsense. What book is that? His friend inquired. Darwin, you must read it. So certainly this is what was replacing, at least in government policy with the Soviets, the traditional foundation with Russian Orthodoxy. So Djugashvili was his real name. Stalin was his party name. Stalin means of steel. Lenin's party name, his real name was Ulyanov, his party name was Lenin, and that means of the Lena River. And he took that name because that was the river valley in which he was imprisoned under the Tsarist prisons, because he and his brother had been convicted of trying to assassinate the Tsar. And see, they were much more humane. All they did was throw him in prison. They didn't kill him.
Big mistake.
Yeah, giant mistake. Well, they made other mistakes were made too. When things were becoming a little bit rough during World War I in Russia, when the Tsar was still in power or getting ready to abdicate, Lenin had been staying in Switzerland, and the Germans let him travel in a sealed railroad car across Germany to get to Russia so he could do his revolution.
Mhm.
So what are the consequences of that foundation laid in Russia? Well, here's a fellow named Ilya Ivanov. Like Haeckel, he started out doing real science.
Here's a matching Wikipedia result.
He was a veterinarian, and he was a skilled breeder of various kinds of animals, especially starting out with horses. And his success in doing artificial insemination, now remember, this is in the first decade of the 1900s, success in artificial insemination. So now, instead of maybe one superior sire might be able to breed 30 horses naturally, 30 offspring naturally, now hundreds could be bred from that same sire with his artificial insemination. So he became so famous that horse breeders from Europe, North and South America brought their steeds to his setup, his veterinarian setup outside of St. Petersburg. Well, he started playing around with various members of the horse family and getting these crossbreeds, zebulas, zorses. And actually what he was doing inadvertently was confirming the biblical concept of kind. But of course, that was not his intent. And then he turned his attention to the bovine family and was crossbreeding Swiss cows with the European bison, and actually came up with a beast that could do very well eating weeds and other less desirable growth that was not cultivated, and able to do pretty well in those settings. And so he came up with this crossbreed here that did quite well in those non-optimal agricultural situations. We also turned his attention to rodents and was able to crossbreed them. And then he decided to try breeding people with eggs, since we evolved from them. And so in 1910, he got approval from the World Congress of Zoologists. Soviet government supplied initial funding. The British government promised funds. I don't know if they were ever actually given. The American Association for the Advancement of Atheism promoted his work. The Pasteur Institute, based in France, had an animal research station in French Guinea in Western Africa, and said he could use their facility. And of course, the Soviet Academy of Sciences was supporting his work as well. So here's a quote from an American newspaper. "Scientists are confident that hybrids can be produced, and in the event we are successful, the question of the evolution of man will be established to the satisfaction of the most dogmatic anti-evolutionists." Take a guess as to what newspaper this was published in.
New York Times.
You got it.
Really? You're still at it.
They're still at it. Yep.
Gee.
So here's French Guinea. And this is the place where the research station was located. And so the attempts were made to put human sperm into female apes, but they were not successful. And so he thought what he would do is bring male apes to Sukhumi in Soviet Georgia, and selected this place because that was the warmest place in all of the Soviet Union, which still is not exactly the warmest in, compared to Africa, but a lot better than St. Petersburg. So then he announced that he planned to inseminate human females with sperm from apes. And he actually got a volunteer from St. Petersburg whose life was so messed up, she said, I might as well give myself to science.
Oh.
Well, fortunately, the sexually mature apes died before anything could actually be done because it was still too cold for them. And so actual insemination did not take place, which is fantastic. But he continued his work, and then for other reasons, because of politics, he ended up being put into exile in Tashkent and Samarkand, and eventually was freed from that, but never resumed his work on this. So then we come to Trofim Lysenko, who was a peasant farmer from a peasant family, but he was a very, very clever fellow, and he understood all too well what the politicians wanted, how they thought, and how they wanted to go about doing things. And so he came with this business called vernalization, which involved treating wheat, different strains of wheat, with cold temperatures to get them to germinate at times of the year they wouldn't normally do so, and then to hopefully increase wheat production in the Soviet Union. And so this was the same concept of transforming nature, as the Soviets said, well, communism will transform man and make man better, and will be able to evolve away from these problems that societies have because of the superior Soviet society. Well, the concentration of power in the politicians who were unqualified to make critical evaluations in technology and science, in other words, to understand it, to know really what was real science and what wasn't, was a disaster, because they ended up giving tremendous power, prestige to this fellow Lysenko, because he was exactly in tune with their politics and their ideology. And enforcement of this official policy was put into place. So scientists who actually understood genetics, who dared to challenge what Lysenko was publishing and saying, either lost their positions or worse, were imprisoned. If not, maybe even a few of them actually killed if they kept persisting and speaking out. So this was a tremendous disaster for Soviet agriculture and society. It set the Soviet Union back several decades in terms of their ability to feed themselves. So you had bad politics enforcing bad science, ending up in disaster. But they also understood the need to transform the mind, to indoctrinate the youth. So they had these organizations, just like the Hitler Youth. And on the left, the poster says, young people are building communism. And on the right, it says they're saluting the young pioneers, which would be kind of like the Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, but politically, we're saluting the change of society. The Lenin-Stalin youth group, Komsomol, the youth group. And you see there the silhouettes of Stalin and Lenin above them. So total indoctrination, just like with the Hitler Youth. Well, this was the Soviet Union with its 15 constituent republics. And then you see the Ukraine outlined here. And the Ukraine was and is the breadbasket of Europe. The soil there is unbelievably fertile. Things grow there like mad, and so the tremendous crops there were a tremendous source of food, not only for Russia, but actually for sale, for export. Well, the Ukraine is also the Bible Belt of Europe. That's where Christianity has its strongest roots. I mean, biblical Christianity. And so when the government policy formulated by Stalin was to seize privately owned land and form these huge collective farms that would therefore be more efficient because you didn't have a bunch of small farms, you had these much larger fields and machinery to harvest them. Of course, the Ukrainians resisted having their land taken from them and then being told to work it and being paid hardly anything at all, if not maybe even enough food to survive on. So they rebelled, and so he sent the army in. Land was confiscated, millions of livestock were killed. The grain in the field was confiscated, the grain already harvested in storage was confiscated, and the Ukrainians were deliberately starved to death. This was in the mid-30s. And so here is one poor child, and the whole thing was called the Holodomor, meaning the hunger death. And it's estimated that a minimum of 6 million Ukrainians starved to death as a result of that action. And again, additional tens of thousands of livestock. I mean, tens of millions of livestock died. So this set food production way back. And so what Stalin did was, with all of the grain that was confiscated, he sold to the West, to Europe, and used the proceeds from those sales to buy the machinery to industrialize the Soviet Union, to change it from an agricultural to an industrial society. Well, other things that he did was that as Hitler's prominence became more and more so, and his power was consolidated, and his policies became more and more difficult for the Jews in Germany, some of the Jews escaped to the West, but some of them escaped to the East. They thought they would be safe in the East. So here what you see is, notice the SS on the license plate of the car. So here is where you see the equivalent of the NKVD. The initials changed every few decades. Today it's the FSB, but same organization. Were turning over Jews who had fled to Russia, to the Soviet Union, back over to the Nazis. So the Nazis could do what they wanted to with them. And this was very well documented on TV in Latvia after the fall of the Soviet Union, when many of the archives were opened. And these are the official seals. I think you can see that SS symbols there on the lower seal, and the upper seal is the Soviet Union, on these documents with these agreements for the NKVD to train the SS on mass killing methods, because the Soviets had already perfected the methods before Hitler got into power. So those were the consequences of the revolution of foundation in Russia. So let's get to the evolution of foundation in America. So Charles Spurgeon was one of several very prominent Christian leaders in the US who compromised scripture to accommodate evolution. Can any man tell me when the beginning was? Years ago, we thought the beginning of this world was when Adam came upon it, but we've discovered that thousands of years before that, God was preparing chaotic matter to make it a fit abode for man, putting races of creatures upon it who might die and leave behind marks of his handiwork and marvelous skill before he's tried his hand on man. Buying the evolutionary scenario hook, line, and sinker. How sad. Well, this had an effect throughout society. He's not the only one. There were quite a few others, so I'm not just picking on him. In the Schofield Reference Bible, it's from a little over 100 years ago, footnotes full of evolutionary compromise of scripture, incorporating all sorts of things that are not scriptural, reading into scripture the evolutionary portions of the story. So it was eisegesis, reading into scripture instead of reading from scripture, exegesis. So here you see footnotes like behemoth being a hippopotamus or an elephant, for example, or Leviathan from chapter 41 being a crocodile. Really sad. Of course, this influenced the church at large significantly. So that we get to 1925 and Clarence Darrow of the ACLU, which had been founded in 1920, and William Jennings Bryan, who had been in the 1890s twice the Democrat Party for president. He lost both times. And Bryan had answered the challenge put out by the ACLU. The ACLU had published in several Southern newspapers ads to find a teacher who would admit to teaching evolution, because in several of these Southern states, there were what were called the Butler Acts, which outlawed the teaching of human evolution, not all evolution, just human evolution. And so the ACLU's plan was to find a teacher who would admit to teaching that, breaking the law, go to court, take it all the way to the Supreme Court, so that all of those laws in all the various states could be shut down all at the same time. Well, William Jennings Bryan came to the aid of the local prosecutors in Dayton, Tennessee, where the teacher John Scopes had volunteered to say he had taught evolution.
Here's a summary from Wikipedia.
Well, it turns out that as the full story finally comes out afterwards, that he did not actually teach it. He wasn't a biology teacher. He was a football coach, and he substituted in the biology class for one day, and but said he had taught it. Why? The bribe was so he could get a college education paid for by the ACLU. So William Jennings Bryan joins the prosecution team, and Clarence Darrow was very clever, and he said, well, how about if we agree for both of us to be put on the witness stand and interrogate the other? And William Jennings Bryan fell for it. And so he was put on the stand, and Darrow asks him these various questions. Who was Cain's wife? And how did man come about? And William Jennings Bryan response was, I don't know, I don't care, it's not an issue. He had non-answers. And this was a very harmful outcome for the cause of biblical Christianity in the US. Well, at the same time in the 20s, Margaret Sanger had founded what today is called Planned Parenthood. That was not the original name. The name was changed during World War II. But her purpose was to abort blacks. She was a racist. And here is a couple of her quotes. The most merciful thing that a family does to one of its infant members is to kill it. So this is abortion back in 1922 that she's pushing. And birth control must lead ultimately to a cleaner race. So she was really trying to abort blacks out of existence in the US. And so her tactic was this: we should hire 3 or 4 colored ministers, preferably with social service backgrounds and with engaging personalities. The most successful educational approach to the Negro is through a religious appeal. We don't want the word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population, and the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it even occurs to any of their more rebellious members. Isn't that amazing? That's the basis of Planned Parenthood. What an inappropriate name. Well, John Dewey was another humanist, anti-Christian, pro-evolutionist fellow who tries to, and succeeded in blurring precision in communication. And so he says here, meaning is wider in scope as well as more precious in value than truth. And philosophy occupied with meaning rather than truth. So he's saying philosophy is more important than truth. Well, he wrote tirelessly, spoke tirelessly, got himself appointed on the faculty at Columbia University in New York City, and started replicating himself through his students. And his plan was to take over the American education system, and his plan was highly successful. So that by the 60s, generations of students had multiplied and were now teaching as he taught. So that was the evolution of foundation in America. So the consequences were things such as this, that physicians would examine people and then certify them as having true genes. In other words, the Aryan race concept, and that they were sane and in great mental and physical shape. So that they should only marry someone else like them and reproduce, and other people ought not to. So here we are in the US in 1913 with these states in various stages, either in place or in progress for legislation to have sterilization. So you can see it was not just a local thing. Tremendous teaching about sterilization. This is prior to Hitler, prior to World War I. Well, there's this very famous case of the Buck family, Carrie and Emma Buck. Carrie was an illegitimate child, and she had an illegitimate child, and she was a domestic aide, a worker, to clean house and do things in this family, the Dobbs family. And a nephew of the Dobbs family came and visited, and she ended up pregnant. Well, it wasn't that she consented, she was actually raped. But the family said, oh no, our nephew couldn't possibly do that. Everything was up and up. So they framed her, and so she was considered a ongoing problem of multiple generations of, quote, imbeciles, labeled as an imbecile. Actually, she had good grades in school, but they took her out of school around 6th grade or so and had her just do work. They never continued her education. And so she was falsely accused of being loose in terms of sexual behavior. She was falsely accused of being an imbecile. She was not. She had normal mental capacity, and so under those laws, she was sterilized against, not even against her will. She didn't know that she was being sterilized. The procedure was performed on her, and she was never told what was going on. And her case was taken all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sanctioned forced sterilization for those considered unfit, such as being blind, deaf, seizures, alcohol, just like in Germany. Why? The Germans followed the American pattern, because this was in the 20s. So later on, she married and could never have kids and didn't know why. Until many years later, somebody who knew the truth came to her and told her what had happened. So those who appoint themselves as more superior to others, the elite, decide that they can decide how other people have to live and have things applied to them, but not to those who make the decisions. So here is Otabenga, who had been taken from Africa and was considered to be subhuman, was put on display at the World's Fair in the early 1900s, and then certain afternoons was put into the Bronx Zoo along with chimps and was displayed as a stage of evolution. And so in this time, there was segregation, that blacks couldn't drink from the same drinking fountain, had to ride in the back of the bus, just all sorts of indignities. And then in Tuskegee, in Alabama, there was a decades-long experiment, you couldn't really call it medical research, where even after penicillin was established as a cure for syphilis, black males with syphilis were not given penicillin. Instead, they were just observed to see how the disease would progress. And it wasn't until the 1960s that this came to a halt. This is absolutely one of the blackest marks against American medicine in the history of our country. And of course, they weren't told that treatment was available and was being withheld. Well, we come to abortion and good old Margaret Sanger's Planned Parenthood. And of course, the justification was that it wasn't human because it hadn't gone through all of those stages of ontogeny, recapitulating phylogeny, supposedly, even though even by 1950, there were photographs of the various stages of development of human embryos, and it was known that they did not go through these stages as well as the microscope slides. So this was the kind of thing used to convince the Supreme Court it was okay to make abortion legal. Amazing. So this chart is 6 years old, but even at that point, there were over 150 million surgical abortions. So when we look at Nazi Germany, I don't think we can really point a whole lot of fingers at them because we are at least, if not more, guilty of unwarranted death caused on purpose than what they ended up doing. And then we've had our government at various times financing foreign abortions. And it's very interesting that there's a correlation with presidents of the Democrat Party restarting that policy and presidents of the Republican Party ending that policy while they're in office. And the current occupant of the White House also put an end to it when he got into office, and because it had been revived by the previous occupant. Reagan was the first one to say, we're not paying for those abortions. So here's President Trump signing his declaration saying, oh, his executive order, no, we're not paying for foreign abortions again. Well, of course, euthanasia is the outcome of this thinking, as it was in Germany. And euthanasia really didn't have much support until after 1975, when I was in my last year of medical school. Karen Ann Quinlan, a college student who went to a party, had too much to drink, and took some pills, ended up throwing up, aspirating the stomach contents into her lungs, not having adequate oxygenation for the brain, and went into a coma. And so after a while, the parents were saying, well, do we have to keep this going forever? And so this went through the New Jersey Supreme Court, and it was sent down that, yes, she can die with dignity, take her off the ventilator. So they did, but it wasn't until some 9 years later that she finally passed away without ventilatory support. So this greatly increased the outcry for euthanasia, but we're talking in this case of withholding a treatment as opposed to active euthanasia causing death by doing something on purpose to actively cause death. Well, Kevorkian, Dr. Kevorkian, who was a pathologist, and of course, you know, pathologists deal with dead people parts and lab specimens and blood specimens, that's what they do, was a very keen supporter of euthanasia to the point where he purposely broke the law multiple times and even did it publicly. And then he was finally convicted. There were several attempts to convict him earlier, but unsuccessful, and then went to jail. And so he was nicknamed Dr. Death. That's the judge who sentenced him to jail. And so he and people like him take it upon themselves to decide when people should die. He was the one doing active euthanasia, setting it up so he would put an IV in a person, give them the syringe with the toxic substance so that they could push it themselves and kill themselves. And he did it on camera, and that's what he finally ended up going to jail for. But here, scripture is clear that it's not up to us when we die, it's up to God. He decides when we die. And then we have the judgment to face. So here we have Oregon, which was the first state to pass euthanasia after the Supreme Court approved it. And so welcome to Oregon Hospital. Dr. Reaper will be assisting me. And then Washington State followed. So the Northwest has for quite some time been one of the most liberal parts of the country. This was 11 years ago. And so assisted suicide, euthanasia. So now we have it in these states where in green it's already legal. And actually, I think this is slightly out of date, more than these 5 states. And in other states working on it as well. Very much spreading across the country. Well, under the Obama administration, Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel was saying, how much money can we save by having euthanasia? In other words, the same thing as Hitler with that poster with the crippled man and saying how many Reichsmarks are saved. How many bucks can we save by having this? Well, he came up with this called complete life system. And you notice how often the labels of something, things are exactly the opposite of what the real intent is. And so this was saying, basically, if you're of working age, you'll get great health care. If not, why bother wasting our resources on you? And notice, even the very young don't have the treatment committed to them because they're still not of working age, but not to the degree that it is for folks who are at the other end of the spectrum age-wise. Rationing. So that's the real thing, rationing. And so Dr. Berwick, who's one of the fellows dealing in the administration with policy, a progressive, I love the word progressive, I don't. Policy regime will control and rationalize financing, control supply. Yeah. That's what Obamacare was all about. When over-demanded service is prevention, annual physical screening tests and other measures that supposedly help catch diseases early. This is nuts. So much in the way of serious disease can be prevented by catching it early. Common sense tells you that. Young doctors and nurses should emerge from training understanding the values of standardization and the risks of too great an emphasis on individual autonomy. So what he's saying in plain English is, don't think for yourself. Just use these guidelines we'll give you and don't think about individuals. Just apply the template to everybody. One size fits all. Paul Krugman, very liberal fellow, says the only way the US will get its debt crisis under control is by use of death panels and the national sales tax. So that's what he wants, death panels. Of course, these people don't want to apply these things to themselves, just to others. So Congress, has a totally separate system for its health coverage. The healthcare reform plan's great. We are exempt from it, and you get to pay more for less. Comparing the old clunker to their limo there. So in the field of education, the indoctrination, as we've pointed out before, making use of Lucy, who actually now has been kicked out of the human lineage because it's been firmly established that it's nothing to do with human evolution. But they substitute other things to continue this line of supposed primate to human evolution. Still teach, it's still in the textbooks that the appendix is a leftover from evolution. Still teach this tree, although genetics has absolutely crushed it. Instead, we should be teaching the creation orchard or forest of the various created kinds with speciation within a kind. That's what we should be teaching. Well, Lawrence Krauss, until a couple of years ago, was a professor of physics at ASU, Arizona State University, the school I love to diss the most, since I'm a graduate of the University of Arizona and we're arch rivals. But his great gift was being able to write the word nothing backwards on a clear board so the audience could read it, saying that the universe popped into existence from nothing. He wrote a book saying that, made some money off of it, but a lot of his fellow evolutionary secular physicists said, this is garbage. But if you want to believe something, then you take that kind of stuff and run with it. Well, the National Center for Science Education is really the National Center for Science Indoctrination. And Eugenie Scott heads it up, and she's an ardent evolutionist and goes out of her way to do whatever she can to prevent people understanding the truth of Scripture. And so the level of education is declining. And so you who worry about Democrats versus Republicans, relax. Here's the real problem. In the Purdue University classroom, they were discussing qualifications to be president of the US. Pretty simple. The candidate must be a natural-born citizen of at least 35 years of age. So one of the students asked, so does that mean somebody who is born by cesarean section isn't qualified to be president? What do you think of that one?
Scary.
Not natural born. Okay, and then Ben Stein, this fantastic film Expelled, goes through the connection between the Holocaust, racism, censorship in our universities and high schools, even grade schools, and how the truth is being suppressed. And he's not a Christian, but he gets it. If you haven't seen this, I highly recommend it. Guillermo Gonzalez was a professor at Iowa State University, published The Privileged Planet. All it talks about is how the universe is designed for discovery. It has nothing about God in it, nothing about creation in it. But even at that, it was so much of a challenge to the way that the evolutionists think that he couldn't get tenure. And that's a death sentence. So he ended up actually being removed from the faculty. We're all too familiar with school violence, Columbine, and many other incidents since then, because we teach our children that they're evolved from animals. So if you're an animal, you can act like an animal, and so what? So we've had way too many episodes. Well, the media is all part of this. 95% of the media are pro-evolution, anti-Christian, anti-Bible, save the whale, kill the baby. It's terrible. And so we have all these media propaganda machines for evolution. And look at this. Dictatorship. Is it such a bad thing? Unbelievable. From 2003. Of course, in our wildlife specials, it's always evolution that's touted. Time, another propaganda machine. And all sorts of books, how humans evolved. And then here we have our poster child for the most outrageous living secular humanist evolutionist, anti-Christian, anti-Bible, anti-God person, Richard Dawkins. And look at this on the right-hand side, all these words, and then it says in small print, sounds like something you'd enjoy, doesn't it? So that's a way of promoting his books. It's written over 15 of them. And so we see all these crazy things going on and compromising the church as well. So we have Darwin Day on the Sunday closest to Darwin's birthday, February 12th. Many churches are now celebrating Darwin. It's unreal. And Janet Napolitano was, I don't know if she still is she still the chancellor of the University of California? Do you know, Jim?
No, I don't know.
Well, she was for quite some time after being governor of Arizona and in between secretary for Homeland Security. So unfortunately, she's Arizona's gift to the nation. In the same way that Bill Clinton was Arkansas's gift to the nation. So you all see all these ways of thinking are consistent. These folks, you got to give them credit for consistency in their policies, but inconsistency in how they think and don't understand the schizophrenia that they live with. Yes, I know that, Sydney. Everybody knows that. But look, 4 wrongs squared minus 2 wrongs to the 4th power divided by this formula do make a right. And that's the way they think. So in Pravda, it must be said that like the breaking of a great dam, the American descent into Marxism is happening with breathtaking speed against the backdrop of a passive, hapless sheeple. I love it. To properly prepare the American populace for the surrender of their freedom and souls to the whims of the elite, population was dumbed down through a politicized, substandard education system. This is published in Pravda 11 years ago. Then their faith in God was destroyed until their churches were, for the most part, little more than Sunday circuses, until preachers were more than happy to sell out their souls and flocks to be on the winning side of one pseudo-Marxist politician or another, their flocks so quick to reject Christ in hopes for earthly power. Final collapse has come with the election of Barack Obama and his team. These make our Russian oligarchs look like little more than ordinary street thugs in comparison. Proud American will go down into his slavery without a fight, and the world will only snicker. Well, that hasn't happened because they misjudged a portion of the American population, but we'll see with current events how this plays out, and I've got more to say about this. Pastor Martin Niemöller was alive in Germany during the time of the Nazis. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. So he's talking about the being business of cowed into silence, of fear being used as a weapon, psychological warfare. So in the life cycle of nations, we go from bondage to spiritual faith, spiritual faith to great courage, courage to liberty, liberty to abundance, abundance to complacency, complacency to apathy, apathy to dependence, and from dependence back into bondage. So during the Obama administration, I would say we were heading into the apathy to dependence, but I think more recent events have started people to wake up out of their apathy. And then the proctologist, you know, is a specialist for the rear end of the GI tract. And of course, the fellow with his placard, the end is near. So the doc says, I sure wish you would go somewhere else. So how do we compare? Evolutionary indoctrination, check. Abortion, check. Euthanasia, we're getting there. Now, interesting, the Soviets didn't do euthanasia, but I'm not sure why. Economic fear, oh yeah, that's the biggie right now. State-controlled healthcare, definitely on the road to that. Guns outlawed, they sure wish it would be, and they're working on it, but we've fortunately had great resistance to that. And anti-Christian, it's certainly growing. Genocide, we're not there yet. So the solution, well, she asks the snake if it's washed, and the snake says, well, I'm not so sure. I guess it's been washed. Missing the whole point. So if we ever forget that we are one nation under God, then we will be a nation gone under. Who said that?
Reagan.
Ronald Reagan. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Who said that?
I don't know.
George Santayana, 115 years ago. So because, although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. That is certainly the definition of evolution teaching professors, for sure. Well, now I'm going to apply all of what we just went through to what's going on right now. Are you able to handle some more?
Yes.
Okay. When I was 16, maybe even 15, but for sure 16 in high school, I read this book, Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Anybody know this book? Read it. Read it. For the documentation of what happened and how it came about. I understood in the head sense what the fellow was saying, but until the events of this year, I didn't understand it at the gut level. So here I'm going to go through what's going on in this country for the past few decades, especially what's been going on really recently. And these are the players of what's going on. And there may be other ones, but these are the main players. And these, I don't like the word conspiracy because I don't think there has been a whole lot. There's been some conspiring. But the common thread of all of these players is power and money. Power and money. So because they're all after the same thing, absolute power and all the money, they end up in, I would say, it would be a loose coalition, at least. A loose coalition. Now, there has been some coordination, and I will be pointing that out. But I don't like to use the term conspiracy because then automatically someone thinks you're a nut. So first, the FBI, okay, founded in 1908 because of criminals crossing state lines and escaping one jurisdiction and subsequent justice. And so through the business of World War I draft resistors, espionage. Then they became involved with prohibition and organized crime. And prohibition was one of the worst things we ever did because it ended up funding organized crime, causing it to explode. Then they dealt with espionage during World War II with, spying from foreigners. And then the business of dealing with communists after World War II. And then in the 60s, really started abusing power. Probably even in the 50s, there was some abuse of power, but definitely in the 60s, especially picking on Martin Luther King. But Hoover had such or hardly anybody dared speak out. So finally, criticism started developing in the 70s. And then after he had passed away, then legislation was passed to limit a director to 10 years. So the FBI started out as a good thing. But then we get to this, what's happened since the election of Trump. And what I'm talking about is not really about President Trump, but it's because he is the first one to stand up against what's been going on. So that's why there are these forces allied against him. But if it was anybody else who's doing the same thing he's doing, they would be in the crosshairs as well. And I want to make that point. So it's anybody who would oppose what's going on would be under fire, under attack. So I want to make this point of the insurance policy. In other words, this particular FBI agent, but there were plenty on board with him, were making the point is they didn't think President Trump would win, but they said just in case, we need to set up some stuff to try and get him out of power if he happens to win. So even before the election, they were already working against him. And then, so here are principal players within the FBI, and this would be conspiring to do what they could to hamstring him and get him out of office. What about the CIA? Well, it's supposed to be only dealing with foreign issues, foreign spies, and foreign dangers to the US. So again, it started out as a good thing. In 1941, known as the Office of Strategic Services, President Roosevelt, Franklin D., started it because of what was going on with World War II, and we needed to get intelligence on the enemy to better deal with the enemy. And William J. Donovan, who had been a colonel in World War I, set it up. And again, the beginning was good, very good. But then things happened. We'll get into that. The Marshall Plan in the European Union. Marshall Plan was a good thing. And it's amazing to think about how the US, after devastating other countries who are a threat to us, then finances the recovery of those countries. We did it with Europe, we did it with Japan, we've done it in other places. It says so much about the character of this country compared to other countries, because other countries, when they beat somebody, they lord it over them and take whatever they can out of that country. So the European recovery, the Marshall Plan, was to make Europe strong for our sake, to be able to better withstand communism and the threat of the Soviet Union, but also for the benefit of those peoples. So these are the countries that chose to participate in the plan. Spain wasn't in it because Spain was not in World War II. They had already had a fascist government from the 30s, and were not in the war. Eastern Europe is not there, not because we didn't offer the money to them, it's because Stalin forbade them to accept it. And so the total amount in dollars in that time was 13 billion. In today's dollars, 187 billion. $800 million. I think I have too many zeros there. So 13 billion originally, 187.8 billion in today's dollars. That's a lot of bucks in those days. And it was a good thing to stabilize them. But here's the problem. By 1970s, Europe had been rebuilt and was functioning, and we should have changed the laws that were part of the Marshall Plan so that we were no longer subsidizing Europe. Europe was able to enjoy its tremendous socialism at our expense because we were have been subsidizing it until President Trump got into office. So all those marvelous short work weeks, long vacations, healthcare, and all that stuff was actually subsidized by U.S. taxpayers. The multinational corporations love it when the laws are set up so that they can go into other countries, buy things there, sell them to us for higher prices than to the rest of the world, and drain our money and make more money for themselves. So the multinational corporations very much dead set against President Trump resetting the trade policies because, again, we are being ripped off and subsidizing everybody else. The Chinese Communist Party, same thing. We've been subsidizing them for ever since they were admitted to the World Trade Organization. And we are involved in warfare with them. Missiles and guns have not been used yet, but every other type of warfare has been employed by the Communist Party. They have no value on life. So they've been shipping drugs into the US to help destabilize our society. That's one of the reasons why the wall is so important, to help diminish that. And so these are the various things that the Communist Party in China has been doing. Creating or seizing islands to be able to control the sea lanes, to control world commerce. These Confucius Institutes are for Chinese communist propaganda throughout our universities and other parts of our society. We have lots and lots of Chinese graduate students in our universities learning about being able to ship our technology back to China, because, you know, in a society in which total control is the way people have to live, there's a disincentive to think, to be able to come with original thought. In other words, to dream up new stuff, new technology. So the idea is to steal our technology. And American universities are happy to have all of these Chinese graduate students because they pay a higher tuition. So it's a nice source of revenue for the universities. They want to delegitimize Taiwan as a separate state, make it a pariah, say, oh, it's just a stray province which should not be independent, because Taiwan certainly competes. Okay, again, to the economic warfare, we've been subsidizing with all these trade deals, and President Trump simply wants to have an even field. He doesn't want to take advantage of them or anybody else. He just wants it to have a level field so that our people can thrive. In our lifetimes, we've certainly seen the middle class diminish in level of living, quality of living, and standard of living, and be able to do things as well as we used to. Intellectual property theft, outright stealing it, not honoring copyrights. The technological warfare, using communication and computer technology to be able to track what's going on in our computers over here, to be able to know what people are doing, what people are thinking, and to know knowledge to swipe our technology and our military security, our governmental security, our power grid security, all of these types of things. And in biological warfare with this virus we've been dealing with, and in Hollywood entertainment for forming public opinion. Here are some specifics of these points I just made. Chinese researchers in our country at UCLA and University of Virginia had with them technology they ought not to have been taking out of the country, and they were arrested as they were trying to fly out of the country with the stuff. Okay, these are not isolated incidents. These are the Hollywood media companies owned by Chinese that are subservient to the Communist Party. It's amazing how much of Hollywood the Chinese own.
Wow.
Yeah. Dealing not only with the federal government, but also with state governments. So Secretary of State Pompeo at a recent governor's meeting has said, by the way, I don't know if you guys realize it, but all of you have been rated as to how friendly you are with the communist government, and not just you, but your administrations are all being infiltrated. So these are the states that are considered hardliners. And it's interesting that they put New York in there. I'm not sure how they figured that one, but the rest of them are understandable. In other words, not being friendly to the communist government. Here are the ones that are considered friendly, and our own Arizona governor's on that list. And then here are the ones they're not sure about. And if you look at this, you can see there's a correlation with these same governors, with the exception of New York, on how they've dealt with the virus issue and forcing people to stay in sequestration. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is misnamed. It should be the Chinese Communist Party Chamber of Commerce, because of the multinational corporations wanting to keep those former trade agreements in place. Because see, since the 90s, your congressmen and senators have not been writing legislation. The legislation has been written by the lobbying groups. And then they simply pass or don't pass the legislation written by the lobbying groups. Well, all these trade agreements have been written by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who takes in money from the Communist Party, takes in money from the corporations, the international globalist corporations, and then uses those to buy off your senators and congressmen. That's why these politicians spend so much money, millions of dollars, to get a seat in Congress or the Senate, which pays only a couple $100,000 or less, because they get millions through the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, supplied by the Chinese Communist Party or the corporations that want the jobs to remain in the third world. Well, there's always been a facade covering this up. And the Chamber of Commerce supposedly was, favoring U.S. companies and Republicans, but not at all case. And then finally, it says the bloom is off the roost. Finally, publicly, just in the last month, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has publicly announced its support for these far-left Democrats, because they will support what they want. Amazing. So it's finally public. Well, that's why the president said we're not doing the Paris Accord. We're not doing the Trans-Pacific Agreement. We're redoing NAFTA so that American companies could stand a chance and be able to have a level playing field. So you implement that NAFTA, the American Trade Agreement, where they pay people $1 an hour, have no health care, no retirement, no pollution controls, and you're going to hear a giant sucking sound of jobs being pulled out of this country. Who said that?
Perot?
Ross Perot in the 1992 presidential election. So you see Bush looking down and Clinton saying something, but in reality, it really didn't matter. At the time, I was really ticked at Perot for being a third-party candidate causing Bush to lose to Clinton. But now I understand it didn't matter which one of the two got elected because they both have the same, in this regard, the same business of the international companies draining our jobs. No difference between the two and the subsequent presidents. No difference until President Trump. Now, certainly a difference in other things, but not in this arena. So that brings us to the Uniparty. At this point in time, with the exception of maybe judgeships being appointed or approved, not a whole lot difference between the two parties. That's why the term Uniparty has arisen. And you may notice that when the Republicans in the first 2 years of President Trump had control of the House, the Senate, and the White House, and nothing happened, it was because Paul Ryan and other leaders in the Republican Party were uniparty, and they didn't let anything happen. That's the Uniparty. So that's why it's important to get folks who really put America first. Well, then we have the far left, domestic, whether they call themselves leftist, socialist, or communist, they're all the same. And so we have these professional protesters that get paid to show up, and they go around, they go through schools being taught how to protest, what to do, how to incite problems, and they get paid and they get bussed from event to event. I personally know some deputies, sheriff deputies in the Phoenix area who've covered when events have happened, like when the president showed up. And they said, yeah, these guys are paid professional protesters. Well, there's this Project Veritas, Veritas refers to truth. And so they infiltrated this Antifa movement and actually managed to document what's going on. That this is purposeful agitation to disrupt American society and bring it towards dictatorship. So it's funny, their name Antifa, anti-fascist, yet that's exactly what they are, fascists. So just recently in Kenosha, they've documented 60% of those rioters were from outside of Wisconsin, transported in to cause havoc. So here we have the situation where our communities are turning on the police, and the police are the only thing standing between them and absolute chaos. And so here we have this rioting, which is incited to cause destruction and greater chaos, so that the chaos gets to the point where people will ask for dictatorship to have false peace, giving up freedom. It's a rerun of what Hitler did. A rerun, because maybe maybe you don't, that one of the events Hitler used was to cause a fire in the Reichstag, their parliament building. Well, he's the one who had it set. So the people will say, oh, wow, we need stronger protection. And this thing with Black Lives Matter, well, no, it's not what it's about, because they're killing other blacks. There have been black children in automobiles shot by Black Lives Matter people. And when you say Black Lives Matter, ask them, well, what about abortion of blacks? the great highest percentage of abortions are by blacks or to blacks. And even on the website, it says that money being given to Black Lives Matter is going to the Biden candidacy campaign. It's all documented. And so here we have these provocateurs who are purposely setting up police officers to cause problems. And then when the police aren't backed up, they're left hanging in the wind. Class warfare, that's what these guys want. You know, the false arguments, oh, the rich are not getting taxed. No, yes, they are. They pay the greatest amount of taxes. And so we have not only small businesses, but also huge corporations that suffer damage to their facilities, such as some of these banks. And so we got this email from our Costco card saying, you know, we had to close some facilities due to damage from these riots, but we'll get them fixed up and keep you safe. Okay, most recently in Rochester, some 3,500 people came in from outside of Rochester to cause terror, chaos. What about the Department of Justice and Deep State in general? Deep State referring to these lifelong bureaucrats who are entrenched and who think they know better than the American people and the elected officials how the government should be run. And of course, they're all liberals. Well, getting back to the FBI and the CIA and the Department of Justice, there's all sorts of characters here. And it is an epic in the sense of it is a cast of thousands who are involved in this stuff. But these are the most prominent people. These are people who have been directors of the CIA or the FBI recently, or the assistant directors, or even in the Department of Justice. And these are all people who are part of that insurance policy to try and get Trump out, you know, whether it be this Russia thing, which was totally false, or whether it be the Ukraine thing, which it's actually Biden whose son got millions of dollars just so Biden could be used to make special deals. And then he threatens the prosecutor of Ukraine saying, fire that prosecutor or your American aid will be withheld. So the prosecutor got fired. So what they accuse the opposition of doing is what they do themselves. Exactly. So whether these folks are going to end up with actual justice being carried out, only time will tell. Possibly after the election, we'll see. And more of these players, they're all involved. The Clinton Foundation is right in the middle of all of it. Extracting money, millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars from people for favors. All these guys, and there's more. And it goes all the way up to the previous occupant of the White House. He was very much aware of everything. And so here is a business with Roger Stone, who did nothing wrong, who has like some 23 FBI agents break into his house early morning, helicopters overhead, you know, heavy armament being used, just crazy. And here was a guy who was broke, no passport. The accusations were of nonviolent crimes, and they break into his house, and this could happen to you. That's why I'm talking about this. This could happen to any of us. 29 agents on the scene, 17 vehicles, armored vehicles, helicopters. It's amazing. Oh yeah, and the press was there to document it. So how did CNN know this was going to happen? They weren't there just by happen chance. Well, the Democrat Party has gone so far to the left that it's not the party of previous generations. So we have these people who have taken the opportunity to be absolute dictators with the COVID virus and shut down all sorts of stuff. It's just amazing. It's unconstitutional. Or this mayor here leaving the White House unguarded, so the feds had to deal with it themselves. These people know exactly what they're doing. This isn't absent-mindedness. Okay, they want to put trillions into the new Green Deal, yet what happened before under the Obama administration was this money ended up in people's pockets. Very little got done. So things that were called a green worker would be a janitor or a bus driver or somebody who put gas in a tank. Crazy. That's what this is about. Goofiness. So here it says, if you drive a hybrid bus, is that a green job? What if you work in a bicycle shop? Is that a green job? It's crazy. This is a Democrat Party platform. I'm just going to highlight a few things. It's an accusation of systemic racism. Not true, but just an excuse to foment violence, to cow people into submission. Medicare for all, trying to redo Obamacare even more so. Fortunately, Trump's been able, in spite of Congress, to undo the mandate. And again, using healthcare as Hitler did to force submission of the population. Gun control, first thing always is take the guns away so people cannot defend themselves against the government. Letting kids at school who have guns be protected so they can kill, cause mayhem. Reparations for slavery, that's a cute one. How are they going to figure that one out? Federal funding for abortion, they want to get that back again. And of course, restricting political speech so nobody can complain. And the border wall, not only keeping drugs out, but keep out the sex trafficking. It's unreal how severe it is. And also, folks who have diseases without being examined. So that they can continue to, or make more so the control of education and indoctrination, undo charter schools, ending vouchers, so parents have no choice. So the rest of this you can read. I'll post it so Jim can send you the link to it. Silicon Valley is part of this as well. Censoring stuff that is not fit the narrative that the liberals want. I like the title, Facebook is fact checking what could go wrong. These are 3 links, but to make the point, the last 2 are no longer available. YouTube has censored them out. You can't get them. And this talks about what's really going on with COVID virus, hospice patients. And then the bigger picture with health, bureaucrats in the government and in hospitals and big pharma. Okay, we're told we could not bury our family members who passed away or have funerals, yet it's okay for these agitators to have their huge demonstrations without masks. Isn't that interesting? So the denial of truth allows easier trespass. Isn't this crazy? Okay, Jim asked me about hydroxychloroquine. It's been successful with viruses in the past, especially when it's combined with zinc, because it's an issue. Primarily, initially, it's not an issue of ventilation that's needed. It's an issue of protecting the hemoglobin inside the red blood cells. So the combination of Zithromax with hydroxychloroquine and zinc is a fantastic, successful thing if given early on. It works well. But it doesn't make money for the pharmacy companies. A new drug that's high cost makes money for them. And so there was this initial put down of hydroxychloroquine in Lancet, the big British medical journal. And then finally they had to admit, when there was enough pushback by physicians, that, oh, guess what? We were wrong. So it's a problem for policy, because the policy has been based on false assumptions. Projections initially made by a British university about how many millions would die were totally wrong and totally off. But those were used to cow the population and to force politicians to make decisions to shut down society. The virus is real, people die, but it's not as we have been told. And then statistics of numbers of people with the disease, the virus, or dying from it have been overblown significantly. Inflation of numbers. And it's been discovered in Texas, it's discovered in Florida. Well, one of the reasons hospital administrators like to inflate the numbers is because they get more money for it. Since there has been the shutdown of elective surgery, hospitals are hurting financially. So if they have more COVID cases, they get more money and can do better. Hospitals have been really hurting financially because of this. It's part of the giant evil thing that's been going on. And here's the articles about what's been happening in Florida with gross exaggeration of the numbers. The hospital itself, when contacted, said actually it's 6%. There's other things like that. And then there are those who say, oh, don't shut down the protests using the virus as an excuse. So these are folks who think very much as the left wing does. We don't condemn these gatherings. So it's okay to have these protests, but it's not okay to go to a funeral. Schizophrenia. Well, the media is part of all this, pushing the narrative. It's terrible. Okay, here's a nurse who worked in Florida where they had minimal problems. So she decided to go help out with New York because they were having such a problem in New York. And she went there and she says, this is unbelievable. Hospital was concerned more about making money than the patients. They didn't have enough supplies, filthy, not cleaning things up, staff not doing the right things, malpractice all over the place, people dying unnecessarily, people who are test negative but put on a COVID floor so they could get sick. Unreal. No wonder New York was such a disaster. Families banned from visiting. So these administrators could do all sorts of stuff that they wouldn't do if people were watching. And here's a link for that. The national press, all part of the problem. Interesting, why do churches have to register people, or they want churches to register people who show up? Future documentation. Okay, media pushing the narrative, not reporting what's actually going on. Anti-hydroxychloroquine media operation, putting it down when it could be useful. Okay, here's some of the information. Blaming shortage of it for people who, who need it for other things such as rheumatoid arthritis. Didn't happen. false accusations made, trying to make anybody using it look bad. So here's one of the conspirators for the insurance policy against President Trump, who they managed to get her out. So now she works for MSNBC, so she can still push her narrative. Willful blindness. And then the media calls these demonstrations largely peaceful when there's fire, arson, there's breaking, looting, people being shot. Oh, but it's peaceful, largely peaceful. This is about the thing in Rochester. Just happened. So, have you gotten a headache from Dr. Haeckel? With Darwin. And so Peter says, partial birth abortion, no stem cell research. Sacrificing of embryos. So do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. In other words, think. Don't just do emotion. That you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So the prescription, he gave me 2 tablets and told me to call him in the morning. We need the scripture. We need to stand up for it. We need to risk being attacked, whether it be verbally or even physically, socially, however. For even if you should suffer for righteous sake, you are blessed. Do not be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. We've got to stand up. We can't be cowed into submission. Sanctify the Lord and God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear, that is gentleness and respect. So our job is to put this truth in front of people and let the Holy Spirit convict. We don't need to argue people in the truth, but we need to put the truth in front of them. As always, the chapters 1 through 11 and verse by verse, going through the first 11 chapters of Genesis with the creation viewpoint, azusa.org. And it's in English, Russian, and Spanish. Here is one book that deals with this and even predicts some of what's going on. Darwin's Racists. Highly recommend it. And here's just some humor to wrap this up because it's been so heavy duty. So the number of physicians in the US is around 700,000. Accidental deaths caused by physicians per year, 120,000. So the accidental deaths per physician, 0.171. Number of gun owners in the US, 80 million. Number of accidental gun deaths per year, all age groups, 1,500. Number of accidental deaths per gun owner, 0.0000188. So statistically, doctors are approximately 9,000 times more dangerous than gun owners. Remember, guns don't kill people, doctors do. So fact, not everyone has a gun, but almost everyone has at least a doctor. So this means you're over 9,000 times more likely to be accidentally killed by a doctor than a gun owner. Alert your friends to this alarming threat. We must ban doctors before this gets completely out of hand. Out of concern for the public at large, we withheld the statistics on lawyers for fear the shock would cause people to panic and seek medical attention. On October 1st, 1861, Charles Darwin wrote in his journal, "I am very poorly today and very stupid and hate everybody and everything." Stuff. Took 2 hours.
Very good. Thank you.
So much.
You are most welcome.
This is the most comprehensive presentation I've heard yet anywhere. Pulling all these pieces together. Beautiful job.
Thank you, thank you. there's no way I could do that in less than 2 hours because it does cover so much material.
Worth every minute.
All right, I'm glad you feel that way.
Well, I hope our secondary audience is much bigger than our primary audience.
Jim, is this recorded so we can, go back?
Yes.
And check out? Thank you.
Yes, and I'll try to get it posted up on our website.
All right, imagine you guys are wiped out.
Well, thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
And
And
Kind of.
Thank you.
If you're still up for it, Doctor.
I'm up for questions if you got them.
This one, we were talking about Trofiru Lysenko.
Yeah, Trofim Lysenko. Yes.
Okay. And if I followed you correctly, somehow he grasped onto the ability to take a social issue. Well, actually, it was farming, I think you told me.
Yeah, it was genetics.
He got and used that for the political gain of others and therefore a rise in power or
Yes.
gain out of it. Do I
Yes.
sense a connection with Bill Gates here?
Well, some people say that the reason vaccines are being pushed so hard is certain people are going to benefit financially from that. Sweden did not close down. They let the virus run through its course. They developed herd immunity. They did not have untoward number of deaths. Their death rate was low. And, they used sensible precautions, but they didn't shut the society down. And they did very well. They're done. They're finished.
wow.
My understanding that the problem that we have is that states' rights does not allow our federal government to come in and correct something like what they have in Seattle, Chicago, et cetera, because that is a state function.
Yeah, the governor and or the mayor has to request the federal force. And so, for example, in Minneapolis, they let things go on 2 or 3 days, and then they said, okay, please come in. And President Trump sent in the federal forces, and that put an end to it immediately. When the federal courthouse was threatened, that since it was federal property, he had the freedom to send the forces in to protect the courthouse, but not the rest of the city.
Okay.
So where the politician has requested the federal aid, it's been sent in immediately and dealt with the situation, put it into it immediately. But the problem is there are these very, very left-wing mayors and governors who think they're going to get political gain out of all the destruction because of trying to have enough of the population be afraid not to support what their agenda. That's their thought process. And I think it's going to backfire greatly. I think there's a lot of folks who are quietly leaving the Democrat Party and or folks in the middle who are going to realize this is insane. So if there would be no fraud with the election, I think it would be a runaway. So that's why they want these mail-in ballots so they can fraud the election.
Makes sense.
And I'm differentiating mail-in ballots on a mass basis from absentee voting.
Yes.
Arizona has an excellent absentee voting program. I've been doing it for years. And there the ballots are carefully tracked, accounted for, and received, and then have to be signatures have to be confirmed with that on file. So it's a great system. It works very well. So definitely need to differentiate absentee balloting, for which you register for, and go through the process versus just mass mail out ballots where dogs and dead people vote.
One of your memes there, I guess that's what they call them, where you have St. Peter registering the embryos.
Right.
Well, we've got that in California coming back again in Prop 14. I don't know if you're familiar with the California Institute of Regenerative Medicine.
Well, yeah, I know that when Schwarzenegger was governor, the state spent many millions of dollars to promote stem cell research on embryos rather than on adult tissue from newborns on. Yeah, see, it's a culture of death, whether it be abortion, embryonic stem cell, euthanasia, mishandling of the virus, as they did in New York, purposely mixing people negative with putting them in wards that had positive. I mean, there's just all sorts of things.
Yeah, it was billions of dollars, by the way. It exceeded anything that California had done in the previous 25 years as far as putting money into the university systems for research.
Yeah.
And so coming back to reload, they want to refund it again. That's what Prop 14 is. We don't want it.
Yeah, it's crazy because it's a dead end. It doesn't work. But using stem cells from umbilical cords or from blood drawn from the umbilical cord works wonders. And the umbilical cords can be banked so that those stem cells are available later in life. And you can get stem cells from an adult, but they're just much harder to find. And they work. We have over 70 diseases that are cured with them.
Right, good.
With the adult cells. The score for the embryonic is 0.
From all of your experience and what we've heard this evening, is there one, I guess maybe you did in scripture, but stand firm, but what would you advise? Where do we go? What do we do? And maybe I'm sorry, I hope I didn't miss that.
Well, the point is not to be cowed into submission. That's the main point. You have to pay attention, tune in to the politicians and vote accordingly. And I would plead for folks who have a biblical worldview to talk with other people and let them know what's going on and say, do you realize that you're headed for a dictatorship if you go down this road? Is that what you want for you and your kids?
Okay. Right on. Thank you.
One other thing that just occurred to me I didn't say earlier. There is, I don't know if it's still available on the internet or not, but the Hoover Institute at Stanford has some videos of physicians talking about the death during this period being higher due to the quarantining and sequestration, due to loss of jobs, suicide as a result of that, drug addiction and deaths, and spousal abuse, child abuse, than from the virus itself. And they talk about the actuarial tables that the insurance companies have, which are sound statistics, showing that when the economy tanks like this, that the certain death rates occur, and that they far exceed the number of people who have died from the virus. And of course, the number of people listed as having died from the virus is greatly inflated, so who knows how much smaller it is actually than what's been published. So all of this, to sum up the whole thing, all of this, the events of this year have been another attempt to remove the president from office or prevent his reelection.
Right.
And these people, whether it be the far left, whether it be the Chinese communists or even these international globalists, they don't care one bit about the value of life. And so they're willing to sacrifice the lives of millions of people around the world so that they continue or regain the losses they've incurred in regard to absolute control of money and power. That's what it's all about. But we are to be of good cheer, because if we stand our ground, we'll prevail. And I believe the Lord is going to use this for the next great revival.
Bring it on.
So
Bring it, Lord.
So I think this is going to stimulate a lot of people out of their apathy. Remember, I told you about that cycle of nations. And I think a lot of people are being stunned out of their apathy, stimulated out of their apathy, and at least in a social, economic, political sense, but hopefully great advantage can be taken of this to get them to awaken to their spiritual condition and need for Christ.
Jim, candidate questionnaires are going out right now.
Good.
Excellent. Now we'll see how much I get in the way of hate communication after this gets posted.